I'm going to introduce Moyra, who's a member of the SWP, but who's also the co-founder of Justice for Grenfell. She's an amazing woman, an activist who's been relentlessly fighting for justice. Now, Moyra is going to speak for 30 minutes, and then we'll have time for contributions from the floor. Moyra, it is up to you. Round of applause.
I'm using it. Can people hear me? I'm using a mic that's attached. I was meant to be speaking with a panel, so I'm going to apologize for A, the fact that you've only got me, and B, from the panel, Lucy Masood, the firefighter, is at Pride because she's the LGBT rep for the FBU, so she wasn't able to make it. And Gareth Pearce, the lawyer, has had to go somewhere. I'm not quite sure. So you'll have me. I may not speak for the full 30 minutes, but hopefully that will mean we can actually have some questions and contributions from the floor. A year on, I'm going to start what I'm going to say about the fight for justice a year on with a video from LOWKEY. And some of you know LOWKEY. If you don't know who LOWKEY is, he's my neighbor actually. He's a local rapper, the most political rapper I've ever heard, and a fantastic activist. And he made this video with the whole of the Grenfell community. So I'm going to start with actually us watching this. It's 5 minutes long, so go. Is it on? Hopefully we've got volume. That still gives me shivers, actually. I think I consider myself, like many of us at North Kensington, as one of the ghosts of Grenfell. We are the ghosts haunted by Grenfell, and I think the only way that we will stop feeling haunted by Grenfell is if we get justice. So, in the campaign, there's been four areas that we've always talked about in terms of our fight for justice. Firstly, truth. Secondly, accountability. Third, change. And with change, we believe we'll get justice. So I thought that actually today I'll look a little bit at some of those four areas in thinking and reflecting a year on and in our fight for justice. Now, there are a number of simple truths. A lot of them I think we're all very aware of. First one is very, very simply that actually Grenfell was an avoidable atrocity. Secondly, that the state abandoned the Grenfell survivors and the Grenfell bereaved families even before the fire and after the fire. And thirdly, there's a number of people who, as you can see from the video, and this is a community video, there's bereaved family members, there's survivors in that video, and there's community members. It is clear that actually we know who was responsible. So I thought I'd look, because in some ways, hopefully in looking at the accountability aspect, we can actually think about the truths in there. Because I think somebody said, I'm not quite sure who, that in war, truth is the first casualty. And this is certainly a class war. So thinking about accountability, I thought I'd sort of go back a little bit in thinking about who was responsible, and who was accountable. Now, that's such a huge question. And I'll try and compress it a little bit in some of the issues that we're having. So, first of all, thinking about the rotten borough of Kensington and Chelsea. Why, when they had 300 million in their reserves, why were they so worried about saving money? So, looking back at some of the documents, we found that actually Kensington and Chelsea put out this refurbishment to tender, and it put it out to tender to a company called Leadbitter, who priced it at 11.278 million, which was 1.6 million above their budget, the budget that they'd set aside for the refurbishment. And I was always perplexed by this. I thought, well, why are you quibbling about 1.6 million when you've got all this in your reserves? But then I found out that actually, in 2012, the government had some rules on borrowing for housing. They changed the rules on borrowing for housing, and that councils could take control of their own housing finances. And they could borrow against their housing finance, but that this was capped. So RBKC could only borrow 11.4 million. And there are documents that I have, and I've seen the documents, the minutes, where they said they were not going to use this money that they borrowed on refurbishment or maintenance. So we know that actually there's been, in all the procurement, a race to the bottom. This has come out in the Hackett report. And so underbidding, in terms of actually doing the refurbishment, to procure work was the only way that this went. So two companies bid, and they selected Ryden, who gave them the cheapest tender. Now we know from other, from construction, from building, that actually this puts enormous pressure to cut corners, and that actually what materials you use. So that it was under this pressure, for the lowest possible bidder, that actually what material was used to clad the building was ignored. It was actually just to keep the cost down at a minimum and to save money. And, the residents actually chose fire retardant cladding, but their choice was ignored. Their choice was ignored again because of cost cutting. So if we're thinking about who's responsible, who's accountable, the first thing is austerity, and secondly, neoliberalism, where actually it's all about saving money and it's all about keeping costs down. Also, if we look at the TMO, the Kensington and Chelsea Tenants Management Organisation, both the Royal Borough, or Rotten Borough, and the TMO have been charged with corporate manslaughter. So we have to look at actually their role in this. The TMO, had a reputation of extremely poor management of maintenance and repairs. Now we know that maintenance and refurbishment is the key to a quality of lived environment and home life for most working class people in council houses. On the other hand, the TMO, the Tenants Management Organisation, had senior managers who were making six-figure salaries, generous expense accounts, and huge pension pots. We also know that the TMO and the council had personal interest in property speculation. What Ed Darfin from the Grenfell Action blog said recently, he said, RBKC, the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, were actually property developers masquerading as a local authority. So this is the history of what we faced. And in thinking about the public inquiry, that it's 4 weeks in, and where we are, I think it's actually, they've got it the wrong way round. I think the public inquiry should have started not with what happened on the night, but what happened before to lead to this. So, we know that working class housing is actually the location of the domestic reproduction of labour power, and social housing in particular is really important Because of the sell-off and the decline in social housing, along with rocketing property prices, it's pushed a younger generation into the private sector, and it's increased insecurity and overcrowding. And as benefit levels for the poor, the sick, the unemployed are drastically reduced, what we know is that housing benefit payments to wealthy landlords skyrocket. So thinking about how do we get justice, those are some of the things that it's not just our community that need to change, but it's countrywide that we're going to have to change. The drain of money from the public sector, from social housing, into the hands of private landlords. We also know from Emma Dencord, the Labour MP's report, that actually Kensington and Chelsea pay private landlords an incentive to take homeless families. They paid, in 16-17, they paid £34,000 to landlords for them to house homeless people. Yet today, of the survivors, there are still 50 families, 50 out of 123 who are in emergency accommodation. That means they may be in bed and breakfast or hotels. So it's a complete disgrace. And therefore, I think if we're going to think about the fight for justice, it has to be linked to the fight for decent social housing. The second thing in thinking about actually accountability, I mean, I'll say very quickly in terms of actually the campaign in the community, accountability in a small way for us is about those individuals who we know, as you can see, who made the decisions to save the money to put the dangerous cladding on. So we want those individuals to stand in the dock and be prosecuted. And they are the chief executive of tenants management and individuals on the council. But actually, in a broader sense, if we're thinking for all of us, the other thing with relation to austerity are the cuts in the fire service. And if anybody's been watching the public inquiry the last 2 weeks, it's been absolutely heartbreaking. And what's come out of it, and I've been there a few days, is, I think, a few key points. A, the cuts have meant that actually firefighters have not had appropriate training to deal with a fire of that particular nature. But also on Friday, and the Friday's public inquiry was particularly shocking, I thought, because it said that the cuts in fire service meant that on the night that the firefighters ran out of the most basic equipment. That included hose nozzles, door-breaking equipment. Their radio communications failed, which meant that details of 999 calls that were made from call centres couldn't actually be passed to them, so they couldn't locate the people who needed rescuing. Also, that actually, because their communications failed, they were carrying information from the bridgehead on pieces of paper into the burning building, all the while actually avoiding a whole debris of burning cladding over their heads. There was also a shortage of extended duration breathing apparatus. And I think for the firefighters and a lot of us, we're really surprised that actually none of them died in that fire. You know, so one of the things in terms of fighting for justice is that we have to have the change that means those cuts are actually stopped, that actually the fire service is funded and resourced appropriately so that they can actually deal with fires like this in the future. Because what we also know is that there are, I think it's almost 300 tower blocks across the country that still have the flammable cladding on them. So actually the fire service really need the training and they need the resources to manage this. On the other hand, thinking up, we have to talk about the cladding, even though I hate talking about the cladding. And I hate talking about the cladding because Grenfell is more than a building with cladding. Grenfell was the loss of a community. There are people and households and families behind this building. But we need to actually, we have to talk about this cladding. The Hackett report has refused to ban it. Actually still hasn't banned it. I'm baffled. What are we going to do about fighting that? I think it's not just for our community, but I think it's for all communities right across the country to actually stand behind those tenants who live in buildings with cladding, to actually fight for that cladding to be removed. But also, we're going to have a concerted fight right across the country to say, stop the prevarication over banning this cladding. Why are we prevaricating? Why is there prevarication? My suspicion is because the plastics industry still want to actually get round it so that they can continue to sell this cladding in some shape or form. It's all about profit. What we know about Arconic, is that they actually knew that the cladding was flammable. And this I found quite shocking, which is why, Arconic are up there. When we're thinking about who is responsible and who is accountable, they are very, very serious contender. It's not just the council, it's not the tenants, only the tenants management, it's not the government who sat in the Lackenall report, it's not the building regulations alone, it's also Arconic who manufactured the cladding. They knowingly supplied combustible cladding to be used in Grenfell Tower, despite publicly warning that such panels were dangerous and combustible. So they need to be held responsible as well. Other aspects of the fight for justice, I think, are things that I've talked about quite a lot in other meetings and that I think a lot of us are aware about. Inequality. North Kensington is definitely a borough of almost a tale of two cities. It's the most unequal borough in the country. We have seen a huge rise in chronic heart conditions. We had the first case of rickets, which is a Victorian illness, in the borough. The life expectancy of North Kensington relative to south of the borough, which is Chelsea and Fulham, there's almost a 20-year difference between the two. So, if we want to see justice for Grenfell and the community, we want that imbalance changed. We also, in our fight for justice, are going to have to address some of the racism that our community has faced. We've tried to ignore it as much as possible. The media, we've seen it in the media. We see the fact that actually there's often a lot of stories about fraudsters claiming money, but we're yet to find, we've got no stories about when they're going to actually question these people they've put on corporate manslaughter charges, the council, the TMO. When are they going to question Bryden? When are they going to question any of these organisations? So the narrative in the media is often that actually the association with Grenfell is that these are a lot of migrants who actually are of a criminal nature to some and untrustworthy. We know that actually the Grenfell Tower residents, a large proportion of them, and you can see from the video, are from a Muslim background, and so we know that they also have faced in their dealings with the council institutional racism. And that's something that in our fight for justice we're going to have to challenge. It's a huge task that we face, but we know we're not going to be able to do it on our own. We know also that it may well be a long run. We know that actually the public inquiry will not give us necessarily the justice we want. And that may mean we have to think differently about how we fight for justice. But the only way that we're going to get that, our justice, is actually with the support of the country as a whole. And we've had enormous support. We've had enormous support from the trade unions, you know, because the fight for resourcing within the fire service is absolutely and utterly significant. We work very closely, the Justice Campaign, with the FBU. We need to get support from all the other unions. We've had support from the Education Union because, you know, we have in North Kensington very serious mental health issue where 9,000 people are receiving mental health support following on from the fire, and in particular the children in the schools who witnessed that fire and who lived for months and months looking at that building, they actually need continuing support. So the fight for justice and the campaign in particular has received quite a lot of support from the Education Union, but we need all the unions. We need the working class together, because these issues, neoliberalism, austerity cuts, is what we face right across the country. And we know we're not going to win this on our own. So, you know, for us to get justice, we need to fight against all those issues which we've been talking about at Marxism this weekend, and we'll continue to talk, because that's the only way we're going to get justice. Thank you.
Last year, Paul McCourt of Humberside Fire and Rescue, there's the blocks of flats in Scunthorpe last year, it was decided, and now sprinklers have been put in. And we've got to get this campaign going around the country. But not only what's happening in Scunthorpe with sprinklers, what's happening with Grenfell, the inquiry, accountability, who's to blame, who's sweeping it under the carpet. What about the people? Where are they going to go? Where's the houses for them? Where's the social housing? Nothing for them. Everybody's clammed shut. And like Moyra says, everybody has got to get behind her. Behind the whole of the Grenfell people, the whole country has got to come together, because this is a one big mess, something that was bound to happen. And I think there should be a study into all the cladding on the buildings, flammable, should be banned completely. But this government is not doing enough, and they should be. And they should be ashamed of themselves that they can sit behind a desk, push a pen, and say this and that, while these residents are still stuck in the same areas, the same housing, the same hotels and everything else. It's time for a change. It's time for somebody to start listening, and they need to listen now.
Right. First of all, I'm no low-key, but I would like to read a poem that I wrote about Grenfell, and it's called Song for Grenfell. As the inquiry into Grenfell continues, it becomes clear we cannot allow the innocent to take the fall for what happened to those tortured tenants of that tower on that dreadful summer night. Those who saw Grenfell Tower blaze up on our television sets, that scene will be forever be scorched on our minds. We all know who the guilty parties were. The guilty parties know who they are. It's time to stand up, take your punishment. Whatever sentence is set, it could not be as horrific as what you bestowed on those poor people? Do you wake up from nightmares of that night every night since? I doubt it. It is time to get justice for Grenfell, not just ice on all burns and wounds. It is time for giving peace to the 72 dead souls who lost their lives that horrendous night. It is not just those who took their final breath that night. Many more lost their reasons to live, left to exist in limbo, unhoused, uncared for, unloved. The charcoal gutted tower remains a monument to a monumentous criminal act. The lazy, crazy acts of the rich and greedy condemned a community to hell. A true crime against the working class of this country, of our planet. We must come together, shout out in harmony, justice for Grenfell, justice for one and all. Without justice, there will be no peace. Without justice, we will not allow peace.
Then I'm going to have you in the front. I'll have you with the necklace.
I just wanted to make the point when you were talking about mental health services in the Wroughton Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, they actually have the least funds, the lowest funding per capita for mental health services in the country and for children's mental health services. All the services offered to the survivors are done by charities. The Royal Borough of Kensington are still not putting their hands in their pocket for any services for these children, for the people in the community, and still housing these whole families in studio flats and hotel rooms.
Yeah.
I live in the London Borough of Lambeth, and I live on an estate called Cressingham Gardens Estate, and Lambeth Council want to regenerate it and demolish it. There's been an ongoing campaign for about the past 5 years. It's been an estate that has been neglected over about 20 years, despite the rents that they've been accruing and the service charges from the residents. I'm very interested, Moyra, in asking you a question about the comment you made about the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea being property developers, because we feel on our estate that there is an element of that with Lambeth Council, who are made up of kind of progress labour. So that was the question I would like to ask you, please.
I'm going to take you in the blue shirt afterwards, and then I'm going to take you with the...
Pat Carmody from Oxford Socialist Workers Party. Just within hours of those horrific scenes, I think we all watched, of Grenfell Tower ablaze, my local council, Oxford City Council, issued a statement to say to those that lived in similar blocks in Oxford City, in Blackwood Leys, and in Barton, Wood Farm, you're completely safe. Your tower blocks are completely safe, didn't have the same cladding and so on. Within a couple of months, had some tests. What was found, that wasn't the case at all. The truth of the matter was, very same kind of cladding, and what we know now, given kind of this was happening all over the country, this could have happened anywhere, could have happened in so many places. And this also, of course, in terms of people's choices of housing, Oxford City is, you know, up there with London, probably beyond London in terms of one of the most expensive, most unaffordable places to live. It's having an impact, as well as the fact that Theresa May is playing a kind of bargaining chip with EU nationals, having an impact on the health service in that they're closing beds in the JA hospital because people can't afford to live there and EU migrants don't feel that's kind of secure there. This is Labour Council. Actually, the housing, the person that's responsible for housing for that council is on the left. In fact, at the sharp end of the housing crisis in Oxford, there's homeless shooting up. Now, there's a report done saying it's got no kind of rage against poverty, austerity or any of these things, saying actually the reason for that is that people are a bit nicer in Oxford and more likely to kind of give people, homeless people, stuff, you know, kind of food and money and that kind, absolute kind of nonsense. That council, at the time this was going on, was issuing penalty notices to the tune of £2,000 to homeless people that were staying on the streets because they were saying this stuff was causing a fire hazard. What disgusting irony, hypocrisy for a council that wasn't quick enough to get the bloody cladding off in Evenlode and Windrush Towers in Oxford City Council. And the final point I want to make is this. What we noticed from going around Blackwood Leys and doing some campaign work around this was Blackwood Leys, which did have a brilliant tradition, actually, a tenant organisation, kind of a tradition you kind of expect from kind of Grenfell and all the rest of it. A lot of that had gone. Insecure tendencies. I mean, people don't feel that kind of confident to fight at work. But I'll tell you what, I don't know about anyone else. When I walked into work, as Grenfell Tower was ablaze, I've never seen such anger from people. I work in a bookie, it's not most militant of places. I've never seen so much anger and working class kind of rage. I tell you, there's a possibility wasn't there then. I think those possibilities and those opportunities are going to arise again. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm from Southwark, and the leader of my council is a guy called Peter John, who is also the leader of London councils. And my council is progress supporting, although recent elections have kind of moved it a little bit. So very similar to Lambeth. Straight after the Grenfell fire, I don't know if people remember that David Lammy wrote an article in The Guardian saying maybe we should just get rid of all the tower blocks. Luckily, he hasn't said that since then. But I think that this was something that was taken up seriously by a number of councils, sadly, Labour councils included. But just recently, Peter John, the leader of my council, wrote in the Local Government Chronicle since Grenfell that now's probably not the time to be talking about estate regeneration. Well, that's what he's saying, but what he did straight after the Grenfell fire says something different, actually, because there's an estate in my borough called the Ledbury Estate. People might have heard of it. Anyone interested should go to the very magnificent Ledbury blog called ledbury.com, ledburyestate.com. The tenants there, straight after Grenfell, discovered that asked the question about the cracks and the gaps in their walls and their floors, thinking that this would compromise compartmentation, that fire would spread easily between one flat and another. They live in a large panel system block, which is similar to Ronan Point. Following Ronan Point, and this is a kind of, a lesson for the future, actually, following the Ronan Point disaster, there was an inquiry, and the government told councils to strengthen all the blocks that were made of large panel systems. It seems that in Southwark, they didn't do that. They claimed to have done it, they didn't do it. There's no evidence for that. So we had people who were in potentially unsafe blocks. We don't know whether they are really unsafe. They're still doing the checks. But taking that on board, the leader of the council started talking about demolishing the blocks and putting in place a public-private partnership for rehousing, for regenerating. And then it turns out they were doing a secret options appraisal on regenerating the entire estate. There are only 4 tower blocks, the rest are low-rise. And they were going to get rid of the entire, possibly get rid of the entire estate, demolish the whole thing. They still deny it, but it's there in writing. So it was only through the actions of the Ledbury Action Group and of the Tenants and Residents Association, who wholeheartedly opposed this and campaigned, that the council has now drawn back and said, don't worry, we're not going to regenerate the whole estate. So I think that lies behind my council leader's comments to the Local Government Chronicle a couple of weeks ago, when he said, now is not the time to be talking about regeneration. But be very clear, they may not be talking about it, but they're thinking about it. And the only way to prevent it is by the kind of action that was taken in Southwark by the Ledbury Action Group and the Tenants and Residents Association. There's a lot of learning to be done there. A lot of things can be learnt about how to fight that.
So I'm going to take you, and then it's going to be you and you. And just as a reminder, please keep your contributions to 3 minutes or less, because we want everybody to be able to speak in the room. Thank you.
Rob Bean, SWP member from Newham branch. And I've got a point which I'd like to really turn into a question. And Moyra, you're going to have to forgive me for ignorance here, because I haven't been as involved in the campaign, obviously, as you have. But what I think the inquiry represents, I know it's set up by the government and they're very supportive of the establishment and so on and so forth, but what it represents, it does represent an opportunity, a window into the state of housing in this country, which we can really take further. It was amazing. I thought that initially the inquiry, it didn't want to have anything to do with the local residents. Then there was a lot of noise and a lot of pressure made, and then local residents got to be able to, I don't know whether they were sitting as, I don't think they were sitting as panellists, but able to take part in the inquiry and give their testimonies to it. Which was an amazing thing, to happen. It demonstrated that organising around this issue, collective action around this issue, made sure that there was a voice for those people and that they were going to be represented within this. And of course, if we can maintain that level of, somewhat momentum which is built up around it, then it certainly gives an opportunity to shed light on the multivarious, kind of housing problems which are facing the country today. I've had discussions with colleagues. I mean, I organise myself in private renters groups and things like this, and people saying, oh, and people in council housing, and they get this and they get that, and isn't it wonderful? But actually, no, Grenfell really represents the lack of the real lack of attention and lack of resources and lack of funding that the government has been, taking away from these communities, for a long time. And that's just, that's just, it's one part of this, very complex picture and this very complex problem. My question is that, when after the fire happened, as our trade union group within our college, we decided to organise. We got some donations together and we gave it to the Justice for Grenfell group. And I don't want it to feel like this is something. Oh, we've got some money together, like boxes ticks. What more can we do to continue to enable you to keep up this fight and keep the pressure going on? Thank you.
Yeah, look, comrades, I think that tower, that burnt-out tower, represents a broken society. It represents a society that absolutely treats working class people with absolute disdain. It's a society that allows working class people to burn to death in a building, in the words of Matt Rack, the FBU General Secretary, that was doused in petrol. That is what Grenfell was about. And you see, what is so disgusting when you hear the news reporting on it, I don't know if people saw, there was an article in the London Review of Books which actually made the argument, the disgusting argument, that the victims and the firefighters need to take more responsibility for what happened in Grenfell. This is disgusting scapegoating. Because I tell you what, how much does it cost to regenerate the Houses of Parliament and Buckingham Palace? £800 million. £800 million to redress up those buildings. And what is so disgusting is that political choice has been made, hasn't it? The political choice has been made that £800 million will be paid, given back to the rich. It's their money anyway. They're going to get it back to rebuild those buildings, and working class people who survived the trauma of Grenfell can't even be rehoused in the richest borough in London. That is disgusting. And I'll tell you what, capitalism, there's a quote, isn't there, that capitalism emerged into the stage of history dripping from head to toe in blood. And what Grenfell absolutely represents is that the system hasn't changed. The system still doesn't care about ordinary people. It still doesn't care about the livelihood of people like us. It's a system that is absolutely based on profit maximising at the expense of any sort of livelihood for ordinary people. So when we talk about remembering the victims of Grenfell and fighting for justice, we have to do that. We have to do that in our workplaces, in our colleges, in our trade unions. But we also have to raise another argument. We have to raise an argument that gets rid of this dirty, disgusting system and make sure that no more Grenfells ever happen again. Because I tell you what, under capitalism, another Grenfell will happen. It will happen. And what we have to be the people in this meeting, in this festival, our class have to be the people that take this argument forward. For the sake, in the memory of those victims of Grenfell, and to stop other tragedies like that happening. And that's what we in the SWP are absolutely committed to. Overthrowing this disgusting, racist, transphobic, homophobic system. If you agree with us on that, you should join us.
After you, I'm going to take you, then I'm going to take you at the back, and then I saw you with the red t-shirt.
So I'm from Southampton, and I've been, a few months after the fire happened, I started volunteering at Kids on the Green. And what Kids on the Green really did from the beginning was, in a way, rescue the children from the trauma that was surrounding them. And as Moyra pointed out, the tower that was standing there every day. So the work I did with Kids on the Green, we did some lyric writing and we did some poetry work. And basically, after a month of work, we've just started performing some of the words and the lyrics, and essentially a song helped by LOWKEY, who's just the video we played at the start. And the words are very much theirs, and throughout that process of me helping them, I became even more motivated to actually do something because of the traumas they were talking about, maybe unconsciously, but it was some form of therapy, I think, to be able to write down what they were feeling and their experiences, because no individual should go through what happened at Grenfell, let alone the children. They lost their friends, some of them spoke about losing friends, some of them spoke about this guilt that comes with it, and, you know, that it wasn't them, it was their friend, and, you know, so on. And that was hard to listen to because of how young they were and how vulnerable they are. But then to see that the support system isn't there is even more soul-destroying. As was pointed out earlier, the mental health issues are on the rise generally, but in a place that there's no kind of system to support that, it's just sad. So I then went on to organise a silent march in Southampton, and there's been silent marches, as I'm sure Moyra is aware of, across the country, from, you know, Southampton, Bristol, I think in Northern Ireland, and it's all happening. And it's nice to see humanity coming together when people are being so oppressed. And when you hear things like, after a year, Theresa May has only decided that she's going to put some funding into helping out Grenfell, but you don't hear that money is actually being taken out of the affordable housing programme. Whereas what Paddy was just saying, they've got money to refurb the buildings that they choose to refurb, but they haven't got money. Money's there, basically. That monetary Theresa May talks about is very much existent, but she chooses very consciously where she wants to put that money. But I think my main point here is that we know who needs to be held accountable. It's about, as a kind of a force together, humanity kind of motivated through solidarity, love for each other, we can push forward and organise more marches. And for me, just because it's been a year on, it's not finished, doesn't mean that a lot of the marches in Southampton are going to be finished, or the campaigning in Southampton. We're going to very much carry on to show solidarity. And when I did the march, I had comments like, why are we doing one in Southampton? It's got nothing to do with us. And some of those comments around some of the digital versions of the reports that I was involved in, people were saying all those kind of comments, and I think it's easy to be angry, but it's another thing to then actually try and confront those comments with a bit more, okay, well, that's your opinion. Well, actually, what if you kind of relate to it on a humanity kind of basis, which is where I came from originally, then look at the facts that around, like Moyra said, 300 buildings across the UK are still covered in flammable cladding. Why are they not removed after a year? I think only 7 so far have been removed, and out of those 300, 150 are actually social housing. What does that say? You know, like Paddy was saying, another Grenfell could happen tomorrow. Why? Like, why? Why is that happening? We know why that's happening, because ignorance, capitalism, and Moyra was saying it's the issue of humanity. We need to all pull together and carry on the campaign, even though it's been a year on. Thank you.
When the public inquiry was announced, the Guardian columnist George Monbiot wrote an article in which he said it's going to be a complete whitewash. And it's going to be a complete whitewash because that's what public inquiries are about. They're about kicking a controversial issue into the long grass until people have forgotten about them. And I have a lot of sympathy with that view, because very often that is the case, but it doesn't have to be the case. And I think that with Grenfell, it doesn't have to be the case. And the way in which things have moved already have shown that it doesn't have to be the case. There is a battle for interpretation, as Moyra quite rightly said. The fact that in the first few weeks there has been an attempt to point the finger of blame at the firefighters is an absolute disgrace. But nevertheless, the battle for interpretation means that the real voice of the community is one that can be heard. And the challenge for us is to ensure that it can be heard. Let me say something about the first few weeks, because it's been an immense privilege for me to spend much of the last year working with Moyra and people on the ground. And it was a particular privilege to be at the inquiry during the first 2 weeks, where there were testimonies from the families and friends who lost loved ones in the tower. Now, originally, a lot of people, and Moyra probably won't mind me saying this, yourself included, had the issue, why are we having these 2 weeks of testimonies when it's not directly about what happened in terms of the fire? Actually, they were some of the most inspirational things that I have ever heard. Now, some of you might know that I am a lawyer by profession, so I'm used to sitting in rooms with people who are very well trained, very eloquent, capable of making very long and very good speeches. I have never heard, and I say this with real sincerity, I have never heard speeches as powerful and as passionate and as poignant as the speeches that I heard during the course of those 2 weeks, because you were hearing from people who knew that their loved ones were not grasping scroungers who should be grateful that they were living in London, but that was a building brimming full of the most brilliant people, engineers, architects, students, people who had studied Arabic literature and so on, the artist, Khadija Say, and so on, the people who got up every day to make sure that this city ran, that the buildings were clean, that transport moved and so on. That was what Grenfell represented. That's what you have in the community of North Kensington. So the simple fact that you had those 2 weeks of testimonies, and I think it led to the programmes that you saw on TV, on the radio, radio, articles in newspapers and so on, remembering what those people were like, came out of the fact that people on the ground have fought. The silent marches have been an absolute inspiration, and it's brilliant that they're spreading to other cities like Southampton and Bristol and so on. Those things have come about because people have fought, because people have organised, because people have learned the lessons of Hillsborough, the Stephen Lawrence family campaign, the Orgreave Justice campaign, that in order to get what... There won't be real justice, because the people who died in that tower will never get their lives back. There will never be real justice in that sense, but the justice of ensuring that people who live in social housing live in the safety and knowledge that they live in decent buildings is the justice that we can achieve. But it will be achieved not by relying upon clever lawyers to deliver it, not expecting the state to deliver it, but by making sure that we organise our community. And that has to be the lesson. You know, go out, support the Justice for Grenfell campaign, support the various other justice campaigns, but let's go further, as Paddy quite rightly said. We will never get real justice under this system. We have to fight for, we have to smash it, and we have to create a new society in which the love and solidarity that has been shown in the support is what characterises the society that we live in.
How is? I'll just make this quick. I am a member of People Before Profit in Dublin. Basically, I feel like everybody around me in my party in Dublin has been so inspired by the people of Grenfell. Their movement is, as honestly, it's been so inspirational for us. You fought so hard, you haven't stopped, and we never do want you to. Until you get the justice that you deserve, we want you to, and we will fight with you in Dublin. We'll continue to do it. Dublin is in the midst of one of the worst housing crises we've ever seen. I've met Moyra in October at Marxism in Dublin, and 3 months afterwards there was a major fire in a hotel in Ballymun. There was an inquiry launched. We still haven't heard anything about it. There was 50 people in temporary housing in the hotel. There was 150 guests. We haven't heard anything. Haven't heard a single thing about how it started. As soon as Leo Varadkar landed in Brussels, he made a statement and he said this was no way related to what happened in Grenfell. He said that this was all sorted, it was protocol, it was all dealt with. Sooner or later, we heard that the fire brigade were not able to deal with the situation appropriately, that our public funding meant they only had 30-metre ladders, didn't have 40-metre ladders. Our public funding is in dire straits. And we, in People for Profit and all left-wing parties in Dublin, we take major inspiration from people like Justice for Grenfell, and we want to say thank you and keep up the good fight. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Isabel. I'm from the York branch, but I actually live... Oh, thank you. Thanks. My tech assistant. But yeah, I actually live in a place called Ketchin in Northamptonshire. And I just want to go back to pre-Grenfell, because where I'm from, it's quite right-wing. And when you drive through, you know, a council estate, or you talk about a council estate, you know, people pull that face off, don't park your car there for too long, you might, you know, find a wheel missing. And it's that mentality that we need to cut out, to fight against, and the only way really we can do that is with a revolution, because the people of Grenfell are victims, and that's all they are. They're not, oh, they're illegal agreements, oh, they were subletting. What, so they deserve to burn to death? No, they're victims, and we can't stop until people see that, until people understand that the people with blood on their hands are the Tories, are the council, all these people here. It's not the people's fault that they burnt to death, and we can't stop fighting until people see that, until the justice that Brian was talking about is won.
Hi, I'm Jane, also from York Branch, but originally from Shepherd's Bush, so I know the area of Grenfell pretty well. And one of the things I wanted to ask Moyra was, in terms of the inquiry, watching it on telly and watching the testimony of the firefighters, what went through my mind is, how is justice Morbick, whatever his name is, framing these questions. And the way he frames the questions actually leaves out all the real content of what he should be asking. Why isn't he asking the firefighters, what impact have the cuts made on your service? Why was the outsourcing of your training leading to the fact that you weren't trained on all these important things? All the questions that the FBU have actually put on their own website, that he should have been asking them those questions, rather than watching these poor guys who've been through hell, who are in tears on the stand, feeling as if they're in the dock for this, which is so wrong and so immoral. It makes me wonder, well, if that's the way the inquiry is running, then I'd like to be as optimistic as Brian to think it's not going to be a whitewash. Well, how can we stop it from being a whitewash if it's framed in that way? I think that's what really kind of worries me. I wonder what your reflections on that are.
Mm-hmm. Last contribution, and then I'll make an announcement and bring Moyra back to sum up.
It's Jen Bristol, SWP, and everything that I was going to ask has just been said in that particularly last one, that last contribution. How can we stop the scapegoating and the whitewash? But some ideas. First of all, we should all be at the FBU stations. We should be joining our local union branches and asking them, what can we do? How can we stop this whitewash? Get them to get motions through. Secondly, what I noticed in Bristol after the fire, a lot of cladding started coming off, but it was for private businesses. It wasn't social housing. It was coming off in private businesses. Thirdly, a lot of very rich people live in high-rise flats, but they've got swimming pools, gyms, superb building rates. It is all possible. We shouldn't dump the whole notion of high-rise as the problem. We should carry on the notion of class is the issue and capitalism is the problem. But I just wonder, now that it's illegal to occupy property, and I'm not going to suggest we all do this, but I'm just wondering, all those rich buildings in Kensington, is there enough movement on the ground to occupy the richest and the best and get all the media from it? Just a thought.
Now I'm going to bring Moyra back for a quick sum up.
Okay. Well, thank you. Oh, it's working. Thank you for an interesting discussion. Just to pick up on the silent walk issue, there was, and this is, okay, I'll take it back. Coming back, one of the reasons when Grenfell happened that I feel I was able to throw myself into that campaign and was my years of being in the Socialist Workers Party. So I'm going to start off by saying that actually years of being in the party has really stood me in good stead. So if you haven't joined, you need to join. We'll start there. But also the fact that actually what we did was when we had the silent walks in the local area, my first instinct was to get it out across the country. And by the anniversary, we had 16 right across the country. So, you know, and that also, because the silent walks talk to the solidarity, but they also give a pickup to the local community. Because yes, we're angry, and I'll tell you what, we are angry as hell, but we're also tired people. You know, we're tired, the anniversary was the first time we had a chance to grieve. We'd held on to our grief and we were fighting all the way through for the year. So the anniversary was the time for us to actually grieve and really, you know, and respect, Brian, to the bereaved families. I think they have been unbelievably dignified through all of this. But just to correct you on that, I was worried about those pen portraits because personally, I don't believe those 72 people should be statistics. Say their names, we should know who they are. They were actually living, breathing people with aspirations, dreams and achievements. But the reason I was worried about it, because it was so painful. It was intensely painful. I spent 4 days out of 7 there, and I think I just cried all day. So, you know, this is what I was worried about. But I think for actually the rest of the country, it represented what the loss was at Grenfell. And that means that actually we were not going to let this, we're not going to sit on this. We're having to put that grief now aside and really focus very tough and very hard on the fight for justice. And one of the first things is actually we've had a lot of hand-wringing and a lot of wearing of green hearts and saying sorry from the Tory party. But I'm sorry, we do not believe a single bloody word. So if we're going to get justice, the first thing we need to do is make sure we get rid of them, because we don't trust a single thing they said. As somebody said, you know, fancy saying, I'm going to give 400 million to remove the cladding, but you need to choose between using it on more affordable housing and maintenance or removing. What kind of choice is that? You know, so the same thing applies to Kensington and Chelsea. You know, a year on, we had a fire last Thursday in Whitstable, the block that's right in front of Grenfell. All the fire doors have still not been replaced. A year on, this is a block that is managed by, you know, the tenants management organisation have now been sacked. Apparently the council is running the 9,000 council houses. The dry riser wasn't working when the fire came out, the fire brigade came to put the fire out on the 16th floor. That's a year after Grenfell, in a block right opposite. They were supposed to actually have gone round and dealt with the fire doors to make sure that they actually were appropriate. They could stand a fire for 30 minutes rather than 15, and they've done none of that. And so, as you know, as the comrade said, they are not putting their hands in their pockets. They are not changing the way that actually they're working. You know, and the demand from the community and from the Justice campaign, in particular around housing, is that Kensington and Chelsea need to be put into special measures. You know, they need to they are absolutely and utterly hopeless, ineffective, and they are actually doing a lot more damage to the community since Grenfell rather than helping. So, for example, they've put nothing up. After a year, if you come to the area, and I know this is perhaps a small thing, they haven't even put a plaque up to say, here are the names of the 72 people that have died. What? They spent 250,000 on a painting to go into Leighton House. That was last year. But they can't even just put a name up. So, you know, there's still a continuing suspicion, lack of trust in the council, and a lack of trust in the government. And that can only change, I think, when we all come together and actually, and I'm sorry to say it, you know, in terms of the inquiry, if people want to help and support, I would say if you're living in London, the firefighters are giving evidence till the end of July. And I don't think it's going to get any easier. I think a lot of us should come to the public inquiry. It's a public inquiry. And we should show our support for the firefighters. You know, I think we should also come to the public inquiry to show our support for the bereaved families. You know, I've been there a few times, and it is absolutely horrible. It's a tiny room, it's cramped, and the chairs for the core participants, which are the bereaved families and the actual survivors, are getting less and less. You know, I think that actually they are feeling completely removed from the process at the moment, but we need to show that actually we're behind them, in trying to use the public inquiry to get some kind of justice and truth. So coming to the inquiry, I think, is really important, and in particular, I would say, in terms of supporting the campaign, is when we have people like, and their turn will certainly come. And this is the issue about actually the disgusting questioning of the firefighters, as if they were in the dock, you know, accused of the crime of causing Grenfell. What we want to see is when Arconic, when Ryden, when Kensington and Chelsea step into that dock, that you use that same forensic investigative process for them. And I think the last thing I want to say, what the campaign has actually demonstrated, you know, from a community that's, yes, we have a tradition and a history. You know, North Kensington, the home of the Notting Hill Carnival, is a long history of fight against racism and against lots of campaigns, for lots of campaigns. We have that history, but I would say what Grenfell shows is that ordinary working class people should never be silent. If you see an injustice, if you see that you're not being treated, appropriately for inequality, I would say all around the stuff around housing that everyone's spoken about. I think people need to get into residents' associations. You need to challenge your landlord, whether that be a private or actually the council, and actually hold them to scrutiny and account. Because if we do that together, we can start changing the narrative around social housing. For justice for our campaign is not just the short-term justice, because as Brian said, we're not going to get our loved ones and our friends and our family back. What we need to do is leave a legacy for the next generation. And that legacy has to be around the way you treat working class people and what resources are spent on working class people, and the fact that actually the voices of working class people need to be heard and need to be listened to, and that we will not just sit down, lay down and take this. We need to build a fight back, and that has to be right across the country, and that's the only way we're going to get justice for Grenfell and for all our communities. Thank you.